Resto Druid has been a super strong Mythic Plus healer all expansion long, and there's no reason to think that's going to change in patch 10.1. Druid is the total package in 5-man content, great throughput, versatile healing cooldowns, good damage that's easy to get out, strong survivability, and a lot of utility. In this video, we'll go over talent, stats, your healing rotation, how to use your cooldowns, how to get your damage out, how to use your utility, the new tier set, so check out the timestamps below if you want to just jump to whatever interests you the most. Let's begin with talents. Druid is not a spec that's going to be swapping out a lot of talents from dungeon to dungeon, but there are some slight variations you can play around with depending on the dungeon and the level of key you're running. Let's start with what I'd call the cookie cutter build that is going to be good in pretty much any situation. This build takes talents from both the cat and boomy side of the class tree, as both cat and boomy spells have their place in how you're going to do your damage. So we'll start off with Rake, Thrash, Rip and Swipe, head into defensive talents, Iron Fur, Thick Hide, Matted Fur, and then branch off to the left, taking Stampeding Roar, Well-Honed Instincts, and Protector of the Pack. Down the center of the tree, we'll take Wild Charge for added mobility, Soothe, Stampeding Roar, and Weakaura's Teachings. On a side note, it is definitely viable to take Heart of the Wild and not Protector of the Pack. My reasoning for taking Protector is that in less coordinated or pug groups, it can be hard to maximize your Heart of the Wild DPS, and it feels really bad to not get much out of a 5-minute cooldown, while Protector will pretty much always get value. In my mind, it's a safer play, even if it may not have as high of a ceiling. In the next column, we'll take no-brainer talents like Swift Mend and Wild Growth, then move down to a single point in Natural Recovery. On the far right, we'll take Starfire, Sunfire, Moonkin Form, Nurturing Instinct, and Astral Influence, as well as improved Sunfire to round out our Boomkin kit, and then go to the rightmost capstone by taking Ursol's Vortex, Innervate, and Nature's Vigil. For slight variations here, you can take a point out of Weakaura's Teachings to grab Improved Nature's Cure if you're going to need a cure or poison dispel in your dungeon. If you want to run a kick, you can drop Iron Fur and Thick Hide in favor of Killer Instinct and Skull Bash at the cost of 6% damage reduction. This is a personal preference and can be good if you're worried about kicks in your group, although since you have to shapeshift first, Skull Bash is a pretty clunky kick. You can also drop a point from Weakaura's to take Typhoon on Sanguine weeks. The Resto tree has a couple of swing talents, but again mostly focuses around some key talents. We're going to be focusing on a very Life Bloom centric build. We start by taking Life Bloom, Ysera's Gift, Nature's Swiftness, Omen of Clarity, Grove Tending, Nature's Splendor, and Flash of Clarity. Then we'll head right and take Cenarian Ward, Iron Bark, and Improved Iron Bark. We'll grab Unstoppable Growth and then the very important Flourish. Heading down the center, we'll take Tranquility and Inner Peace to reduce its cooldown and add a defensive component. We're going to start working toward a bunch of Life Bloom synergies now, starting with Harmonious Blooming, which is going to make the targets of our Life Bloom get some serious healing from our mastery. At this point, we'll grab Adaptive Swarm and its supporting talent Unbridled Swarm, Budding Leaves to again buff our Life Bloom, the ever so versatile Convoke, Cenarius' Guidance to make Convoke 60-second cooldown, and to top it off, we'll take Undergrowth for double Life Blooms. Heading over to the far left, we take Efflorescence, Verdancy, another Life Bloom synergy for when Life Bloom blooms inside of Efflo, Spring Blossoms, and then one of the few swing talents in the whole tree, Circle of Life and Death or Deep Focus. Circle is more AoE focused and will cause your dots to do more damage faster. Deep Focus will increase your single target DPS, so you can alternate these based on Tyrannical or Fortified weeks, or just kind of play around with whichever one feels better to you. Finally, we'll cap it off with Photosynthesis for our Life Blooms, giving us different buffs when we have a Life Bloom on another player and on ourselves, but since we have double Life Blooms, we can benefit from both. On the topic of stats, you should really just prioritize item level over anything else, but given the choice between similar item level gear or when making crafted gear, we want to follow the priority of Haste, better than Verse, better than Crit, better than Mastery. Haste increases the ticking speed of your heal and damage over time spells, making it our strongest stat. Verse is also good both offensively and defensively. Mastery is a pure healing stat, but as a druid, you should have the throughput to get by in Mythic Plus, so Haste is a better all-around stat. Alright, let's get into the fun stuff. Let's talk about the healing rotation. Even though we're not going to gear for Mastery and M+, Druid Mastery is still core to the gameplay, and essentially it equates to this. The more heal over time spells you have on a target, the more healing you do to them. This is the basis of your whole existence as a Resto Druid. I always like to think of healing rotations in layers, and this philosophy applies really well to Resto Druid. For starters, you've got your basic upkeep spells. These are just things you want to run all the time. For Druid, that's Efflow on the ground on as many people as possible, most likely in melee, Life Bloom, and Cenarian Ward. Make it your first priority to keep these spells up non-stop. While you do benefit from your photosynthesis talent when you have one Life Bloom on yourself and one on another player, don't feel the need to be too strict about this. Life Bloom is a major heal over time, so make sure it's on people taking damage. You don't always need to default to having it on yourself and the tank, although that's not a bad place to start. Finally, as a maintenance spell, we have Adaptive Swarm. You'll definitely be rewarded from both a healing and damage perspective by being on top of getting swarm spread all over your group. The best way to achieve this is to cast it on a friendly player with 3 stacks or less, with the goal of having multiple 5-stack adaptive swarms flying all over the place between friendly players and mobs. Once damage dictates that your simple maintenance spells are not enough, your next layer of spells consists of Rejuvenation, Wild Growth, Regrowth, and Swift Mend. Rejuve is a great single target heal over time spell that you can really toss on anyone taking damage. Wild Growth is the AoE version of that, so use it when multiple people are taking damage, and then Regrowth is your single target spot heal. Just keep in mind that you don't want to lean on Regrowth too hard. It will perform way better on targets that are pumped full of hots because of your mastery, so spamming it alone on a single player is not a good move. Swiftmend also comes into play here, but because of the Soul of the Forest talent, we want to be a little bit selective about when we use it. Because of this talent, after Swiftmend is used, your next Rejuve, Regrowth, or Wild Growth will be buffed considerably. Keep this in mind when you use Swiftmend and try to get some value out of this talent. An example would be using Swiftmend shortly before AoE damage is going to go out and then using a Soul of the Forest buffed Wild Growth. Swiftmend itself is a nice instant cast single target heal though, so don't hold on to it too much, just be aware of the SOTF talent and try and get some value out of it. After that, it's cooldown time. I'd say Druid cooldowns are a real strength of the spec, and let's start with probably the most important one, Flourish. Flourish basically supercharges heal over time spells for 8 seconds. This is a cooldown that rewards pre-planning, so the way to use it is to get your hot spells out, and then when damage comes, hit Flourish and watch them pop off. Flourish is also only on a 1.5 minute cooldown, so you should be using it very liberally whenever considerable damage is going out. Although we aren't at the DPS section just yet, we'll talk about using Flourish offensively there too by macroing it with Nature's Vigil. Flourish is a great button to macro along with any trinkets or racial abilities you have as well. Convoke is essentially a random bullshit go button that will favor spells of the shape-shifted form you're in. If you're in person form, it will favor healing spells, channel for a couple seconds throwing out a bunch of random spells. Although it is a bit random, it does always do a considerable amount of healing and can be thought of as a small to medium-sized healing cooldown. Since it's on a 1 minute cooldown, let it fly. We'll also talk about using this one offensively in the DPS section of the video. Tranquility is the classic Druid cooldown, and while it is a bit limited, it can be very powerful. We'll stand still and channel the big heal over time spell that does benefit from your mastery. That means Tranquility will benefit greatly from being layered on top of a bunch of other heal over time spells. Casting a naked Tranquility will not do the amount of healing you're going to want it to do, so plan ahead. Keep in mind that since we took the Inner Peace talent, Tranquility gives you 20% damage reduction while casting. Take advantage of this and start channeling it right before damage goes out to use it as a personal defensive. The obvious limitation here is the long channel time and immobility, so plan to use Trank when you know you'll be able to plant your feet for a good while, or you won't get much out of it. It is a really powerful spell when used under the right circumstances. While Druid cooldowns may not seem totally overwhelming, a big advantage of them is their very short CDs. 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, and 2 minutes. That means you're looking at multiple uses over the course of a boss fight or even a lengthy trash pack. You want to be continually rotating through these as you learn which ones work best and at what times. I've had a lot of people ask me how to do DPS on a Druid, and I admit it's a little unintuitive compared to some of the past versions of the spec. A common misconception is that most of your damage will come from your shape-shifted forms, and that's just not true. The bulk of your damage is going to come from your dots, so if you want to do DPS, be diligent about keeping Moonfire and Sunfire up with as much uptime as possible. A good way to do this is to get Moonfires out as the tank's gathering up mobs, and then drop a Sunfire on them once they've been grouped up to minimize the GCDs needed to dot everything. Also remember that Adaptive Swarm represents a nice chunk of your DPS too, and as mentioned in the maintenance spell section, try and be on top of using it off cooldown and putting it on a friendly target with 3 or less stacks. After your dots, the next most important way you're going to do DPS is your Nature's Vigil damage, which does single target damage based on the amount of healing you do while it's active. So to take advantage of that fact, it's standard for druids to macro Nature's Vigil with Flourish because they have the same cooldown, along with any racial abilities or trinkets that will help increase throughput during that time. This basically creates a nuclear healing and damage button, and it's not unusual for Nature's Vigil to represent one of your top 3 damaging abilities in an M+ run. That means pressing Flourish and NV button really liberally. Just make sure you don't blow it for DPS right before a situation where you're going to need it for healing. Your Convoke spell can also be used offensively. It's only a minute cooldown, and like all cooldowns, you want to get as many uses out of it as possible. So if you're not going to be needing it for healing, let a Convoke fly for damage. The general rule is to cat form Convoke on single target and boomkin Convoke on AoE. Okay, now, and only now after all that stuff comes your actual shape-shifted damaging abilities, because they frankly aren't that great on their own. I don't really ever shapeshift into boomy form unless I'm using Convoke, and I really only shift into cat after I've exhausted all the above methods of DPS. When cat weaving, you're basically going to want to maintain your rip and rake on single target and use your uncapped thrash on big AoE pulls. There are also some consumables that will help your DPS game quite a bit as well. I like to use Vials of Glacial Fury, which does quite a bit of DPS passively, and Potion of Shocking Disclosure for big AoE pulls. And of course, your weapon runes. Yep, even this stuff will typically out DPS your basic shapeshift abilities, so don't overlook them. Let's quickly talk about survivability now. Not being dead is one of Resto Druid's best assets. Barkskin is a great personal defensive, so use it when you know big damage is coming. On top of that, absolutely take advantage of Bear Form. Bear Form gives you a ton of stamina, and popping it either on its own or in tandem with Barkskin is a great way to survive really nasty damage. Finally, as mentioned earlier, you've talented into Inner Peace and added a defensive component to your Tranquility, so be sure to start that channel before the damage goes out to take advantage of that 20% DR. Let's wrap this up with utility, which you've got a lot of. Number 1 is probably Incapacitating Roar. Since you're likely not running Kick, this is the best way you're contributing CC on most pulls. Try and time it so that you hit it just as any dangerous casts are going out to interrupt them, and you'll greatly reduce the amount of damage going out on your party. As a druid, you're highly mobile. Don't forget that a simple shapeshift can get you out of any movement impairing ability, and on top of that, you've got Wild Charge. Human form Wild Charge can be great for dodging mechanics or just moving around quickly, but remember that cat form Wild Charge will take you to the back of an enemy, and boomkin Wild Charge is a disengage. These all have niche uses. You've also got Stampeding Roar. You can pop this anytime there's just an obnoxious amount of running in a dungeon that's costing you time, or anytime your party might need a little extra speed boost to dodge something. Ursul's Vortex has some great uses. On Spiteful Week, I find myself using this off cooldown to keep ghosts away from people, but it's also a great way to help your tank anytime you see them trying to kite. Also, if your tank actually dies, popping an Ursul's on top of a B-Res, of course, is a great way to give everyone else an extra moment to create some space between mobs before they start getting meleeed down. Innervate is quite useful in dungeons, as Druid is a pretty mana-intensive spec. In M+, you're basically only using this on yourself. Just remember what it actually does. Allows you 10 seconds of mana-free casting, not actually returning mana. So use it when you know you're going to be spamming a lot of heals. Finally, I just briefly want to talk about your UI needs as a Resto Druid. As a Druid, space on your party frames is at a premium, as you're going to have way more spells active on players than any other healing spec. The default Blizzard UI doesn't allow you to see a lot of heal over times active at once. I personally use a customized Elv UI to track hots that are actually important to see, like Life Bloom, Rejuve, Wild Growth, not the ones that are just kind of happenstance like Spring Blossoms. It also shows adaptive swarm stacks effectively for good spreading. If you're interested in using it or any other aspects of my UI, check out channel memberships by clicking on the join button below the video. The Resto Druid tier set in 10.1 is quite good. The 2 set, Rejuvenation and Life Bloom healing increased by 15%, and Regrowth healing over time increased by 75%, and the 4 set, Flourish increases the rate of your heal over time effects by 40% for an additional 16 seconds after it ends. And Verdant Infusion causes your Swift Mend target to gain 15% healing from you for 6 seconds. So these are basically passive buffs to your healing. It's not going to change much about your gameplay, but you are going to want to track down this tier set as quickly as you can because it's going to increase your healing power considerably. I really hope you guys find this guide useful in your Resto Druid Mythic Plus journey. If you think I left anything out, go ahead and drop that in a comment section. If you enjoyed the video and you made it this far, I always appreciate a thumbs up, or you can subscribe to see more of my content in the future. I also stream right here on YouTube Tuesday, Thursday, Saturdays, 9 p.m. Pacific, where I pretty much exclusively heal keys on a whole bunch of different specs. Pop in there if you want to say hi, ask me any questions, or just have a good time. I'd love to see you there. Until next time, guys, happy healing.